Some killers hide behind masks, some blend into crowds, and some are so unsettling because they seem, on the surface, almost impossible to miss. Edmund Kemper stood around 6'9", spoke with eerie calm, and often appeared startlingly self-aware. Long before his name became infamous, he had already committed a double murder at age 15, killing his grandparents in 1964, then spent years in a state hospital before being released back into society. Within a few years, he began a series of murders in and around Santa Cruz, targeting young women, many of them college students, which earned him the name the Co-Ed Killer and the Co-Ed Butcher. But what made Kemper especially terrifying was not only what he did, it was how long he was able to function around other people. He was intelligent, he was articulate, he understood police culture, he had interacted with mental health professionals, and after murdering 6 young women between May 1972 and April 1973, he finally turned his violence toward the person he blamed for much of his rage, his mother. After killing her and then her friend Sally Hallett, he fled California, called police from Colorado, and confessed. This is not a story about myth. It is not a story about horror movie evil. It is a real case, one that forces an uncomfortable question into the center of the screen. Was Edmund Kemper born to kill, or was he a violent man shaped by a mix of cruelty, resentment, fantasy, and catastrophic institutional failure? Tonight, we revisit the terrifying case of Edmund Kemper, the young man who killed his grandparents, manipulated the system that released him, hunted female students around Santa Cruz, and then confessed after murdering his mother. He was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder in 1973 and remains imprisoned in California, where he was denied parole again in 2024. This is the terrifying case of Edmund Kemper, the Co-Ed Killer, Born to Kill, Part 1, The Boy Who Already Frightened People. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. Later accounts of his childhood describe a deeply troubled home life marked by resentment, instability, and emotional conflict after his parents divorced when he was young. His mother moved with him and his sisters, and Kemper would later portray that relationship as humiliating, bitter, and psychologically damaging, though those claims explain nothing away and do not excuse what he became. What matters in a case like this is not whether childhood pain automatically creates a killer. It does not. Many people survive terrible childhoods without ever hurting anyone. But in Kemper's case, those early years seem to have become part of a violent inner world that was already taking shape. Accounts of his youth describe disturbing behavior, fascination with death, hostility toward women, and fantasies that were not normal teenage anger but something colder and darker. Later reporting and biographical coverage note that people close to him saw warning signs long before the murders that made him famous. And then, at 15 years old, Kemper crossed a line that should have ended any doubt about the danger he posed. On August 27, 1964, he killed his paternal grandparents. According to summaries of the case, he shot his grandmother after an argument and later shot his grandfather when he returned home. Kemper later gave different explanations, but the essential fact never changed. At 15, he had already committed 2 murders. He called authorities afterward and was eventually sent to Atascadero State Hospital after court psychiatrists deemed the crime extraordinary and deeply abnormal for someone his age. That first double murder is where the born to kill question begins, because when someone kills at 15, and not in a sudden schoolyard fight, not in a chaotic accident, but in a way that signals deep psychological violence, society naturally wants an answer. Was this always there? Was the violence inevitable? Or was this the point where intervention still could have prevented everything that came next? We can never know for certain, but we do know this. By 1964, Edmund Kemper was already a murderer. And yet, that was not the end of the story. It was only the first chapter. Part 2, The System That Let Him Out. After killing his grandparents, Kemper was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric institution in California. He remained in state custody for years, and this part of the story matters because it reveals one of the most chilling truths about the entire case. The system had direct contact with him, studied him, evaluated him, and still failed to stop what came next. According to later reporting, Kemper was considered intelligent and highly manipulative. Accounts of his time in confinement say he became familiar with psychiatric testing and learned how to present himself in a way that made him appear more stable than he truly was. People magazine's 2025 review of the case notes that he had memorized psychological tests and acceptable answers while institutionalized, which later fed the enduring belief that he had effectively gamed the system. That detail is crucial, because Kemper was not simply released by accident, he was evaluated. He was reviewed. And despite the fact that he had murdered 2 family members as a teenager, he was eventually released from custody after being deemed rehabilitated enough to return to the outside world. Historical summaries place his release on or around his 21st birthday in 1969, after about 5 years in state confinement. He was then allowed to live with his mother in California, even though some professionals reportedly opposed that decision. That release now reads like a warning written in reverse, because we know what happened afterward. The hospitals, the evaluations, the reports, all of it looks different when viewed from the future. This was not a misunderstood young man who quietly rebuilt his life. This was a double murderer who went on to kill again. And not once, not twice, but repeatedly. He left the institution, moved back into society, drifted around Santa Cruz, and began living a strange half-life, part working man, part drifter, part observer of police culture, part growing predator. Biographical summaries say he had hoped to become a police officer but was rejected, and that he later spent time around local bars where law enforcement also gathered, giving him a disturbing sense of familiarity with the environment around criminal investigation. That is one reason Kemper continues to fascinate criminologists and terrify viewers. He was not only violent, he was observant. He studied people. He learned systems. He performed normalcy. And underneath all of that, the urges that had already surfaced in adolescence were still there, waiting. Part 3, Santa Cruz and the beginning of the co-ed murders. By the early 1970s, Santa Cruz had become a city under unusual pressure. Several notorious killers were active in the wider region around the same time, and the press would eventually call Santa Cruz the murder capital of the world. In that atmosphere, Edmund Kemper began the series of murders that defined his infamy. He became known as the co-ed killer because many of his victims were young female students hitchhiking near Santa Cruz. His method was built on access and deception. He used his car to pick up hitchhiking women, something that in that era was far more common and socially normalized than it would later become. Historical summaries say he had already picked up many hitchhikers without incident before he began killing, which likely helped him refine the image he wanted to present: calm, helpful, non-threatening enough to get a stranger into the vehicle. Then, on May 7, 1972, the known co-ed murders began. Kemper picked up 2 Fresno State students, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, who were hitchhiking to visit friends. He later murdered both women. Their deaths marked the start of the Santa Cruz killing spree that would continue for nearly a year. This was not a single outburst. It was the beginning of a pattern. That first pair of killings matters because it reveals something important about Kemper's psychology. He was not improvising in total chaos. He was acting out a fantasy pattern that blended resentment, control, and predation. Later interviews and summaries suggest he often described the young women as stand-ins for his broader rage, especially toward his mother. That does not make the crime symbolic in any useful sense. It simply shows how he mentally reframed real women into targets inside his private grievance system. And this is where the title Born to Kill becomes more complicated. Because Kemper was not a wild, mindless offender. He was frighteningly organized in the way he selected opportunity. He knew how to present himself. He moved through the world with enough control to lure victims, transport them, and avoid immediate capture. This was not only violence. It was violence combined with planning. Part 4, The Victims and the Escalation. Between May 1972 and April 1973, Kemper murdered 6 young women before killing his mother and her friend. Historical reporting identifies these young victims as college students and 1 high school student, most of whom he encountered while they were hitchhiking. The known victims during this stretch included Marianne Pesci, Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu. It is important, especially in a documentary script, not to let a serial killer's mythology erase the people he targeted. These were not types. They were real women with names, routines, plans, classes, families, and futures. Aiko Koo, for example, was only 15. A high school student, not a college co-ed, which is one reason the public nickname does not fully describe the scope of Kemper's violence. The label made for a memorable headline, but the real story was broader and more tragic. He did not murder abstractions. He murdered individuals. As the killings continued, Kemper's confidence appeared to grow. He was operating in a world where hitchhiking gave him access, where police did not yet have a full picture of the offender, and where he could keep moving between ordinary life and unspeakable violence. In some accounts, he even used a University of California, Santa Cruz parking sticker associated with his mother's work to make himself appear more familiar and less threatening to female students. This phase of the case is terrifying not only because of the murders themselves, but because of how close Kemper remained to everyday normal life. He went to bars. He talked to people. He drove around like anyone else. There was no public sign hanging over him that said serial killer. That is what many people find so disturbing in retrospect. The ordinariness around the crimes, the ability to do terrible things and then step back into an ordinary frame. By early 1973, the pattern had become even more brazen. The killing of Cindy Shaw in January and Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu in February made clear that this was not a temporary burst of rage, it was sustained predation, and yet he was still not stopped. At this point, it is tempting for audiences to look for one single explanation: monster, madness, abuse, evil, fate. But the real answer is messier. Kemper was not made by one thing. He seems to have been a convergence of many dangerous elements: early violence, sexualized hostility, manipulative intelligence, institutional failure, resentment, and opportunity. That does not fit neatly into Born to Kill, but it is far more frightening because it is real. Part 5. The mother at the center of his rage. If there is one relationship at the emotional center of the Kemper case, it is the relationship with his mother, Clarnell. By his own later accounts, he deeply hated her, blamed her for humiliating and belittling him, and described years of emotional warfare in the home. Biographical coverage consistently notes that Kemper himself, and some later commentators, viewed the murdered students as surrogates for his ultimate psychological target, his mother. That does not mean the earlier victims were somehow secondary. They were not. They were murdered in their own right. But understanding Kemper's fixation on his mother helps explain why the case culminates where it does. He had already killed his grandparents as a teenager. He had already murdered 6 young women as an adult, and yet he still described the central emotional battlefield of his life as the war between himself and his mother. That tells us something important about the internal logic of his violence. The murders were not random in his mind. They were part of a fantasy structure, a private universe where rage, humiliation, and domination fed one another over time. By April 1973, that final confrontation arrived. On the night of April 20 into April 21, 1973, Kemper killed his mother after she returned home and went to sleep. Historical accounts agree on the broad outline. He attacked her in her bedroom, killed her, and later carried out additional degrading acts afterward. Soon after, he also lured and killed her friend Sally Hallett. There is no need to dwell on the most graphic details to understand the significance of that moment. This was the psychological center of the case. The woman he blamed. The woman he said had tormented him. The woman who, in his own words and in many later retellings, represented the root of his fury. And once she was dead, something changed. Not because he felt peace, but because, by his own later explanation, the purpose of the killings was gone. That statement is one of the most unsettling in the entire case. It suggests that even after multiple murders, Kemper still viewed himself as moving toward some final target, and once he reached it, the spree had lost its internal meaning for him. That is not insight in any noble sense. It is the cold self-analysis of a man who had already destroyed many lives and then tried to narrate his own collapse as if he were both subject and commentator. And that self-awareness would become one of the most unnerving aspects of everything that came after. Part 6. The Confession from Colorado. After killing his mother and Sally Hallett, Kemper fled California and drove east to Pueblo, Colorado. Historical summaries describe the trip as a long, exhausting drive taken almost without stopping. He had weapons in the car and believed he might already be the subject of a manhunt. But when he arrived and did not hear immediate news coverage reflecting the full reality of what he had done, he made the decision that ended the spree. He called police and confessed. Even that part of the story feels unreal. A serial killer who does not need to be cornered. A man who has already evaded capture for months. A murderer who, instead of disappearing completely, starts making phone calls. At first, police reportedly did not take the confession seriously. Kemper was known to some officers as Big Ed, a large, talkative local figure, not the hidden face of the co-ed murders. But he called again, spoke to an officer who knew him, and made it clear that he was telling the truth. He was then taken into custody, and after that, the full case began to unfold. This moment is often portrayed as evidence of conscience, but that is too simple. Kemper did not confess because a moral awakening restored him. By the time he called, 8 women were dead in the 1972-73 series, on top of the grandparents he had killed years earlier. His own later explanation was more bleak than redemptive. The purpose was gone, the emotional engine had collapsed, and he could not sustain it any longer. In other words, the confession was not nobility, it was exhaustion, collapse, maybe even narcissism, the desire to finally define the narrative himself. Because from that point on, Kemper became not only the subject of the case, but one of its chief storytellers. He was unusually articulate in interviews. He gave detailed explanations. He fascinated psychologists, reporters, and later true crime audiences. And that has created a serious challenge for anyone telling this story today. How do you examine Edmund Kemper without letting Edmund Kemper become the author of his own legend? The answer is to stay with the facts. And the facts are simple. He confessed, he was arrested, and the killings stopped. Part 7. The Trial and the Insanity Defense. Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder in May 1973 for the 1972-73 killings. Because of his detailed confessions and obvious psychological abnormalities, His legal team pursued a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. But that strategy ultimately failed. Historical summaries report that 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found him legally sane, and the jury agreed. This is one of the most important legal points in the case. A person can be disturbed, disordered, and deeply abnormal and still be legally sane. That is what the court concluded here. Under the legal standard used in California at the time, the issue was whether Kemper understood the nature of what he was doing and knew it was wrong. The prosecution argued that he did. The evidence of concealment, planning, transportation, victim selection, and post-crime behavior all supported that conclusion. Kemper himself took the stand. He tried to persuade the jury that he was insane, describing inner divisions in himself and portraying his actions as the work of a fractured personality. But jurors were not convinced. On November 8, 1973, after roughly 5 hours of deliberation, they found him sane and guilty on all counts. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment. That outcome matters because it draws a line many viewers still struggle with. Kemper was undeniably abnormal, but the court decided he was still responsible. And in documentary storytelling, that distinction is essential. He was not some supernatural force. He was not an unknowable creature beyond human judgment. He was a man who murdered repeatedly, knew enough to plan and conceal, and was therefore held criminally accountable. After conviction, he was sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he remains incarcerated decades later. His notoriety only grew with time, fueled in part by the disturbing calm and fluency with which he later discussed his crimes. But legal notoriety is not freedom. He is still in prison. Part 8, where he is now. Edmund Kemper has spent more than 50 years in custody. Later coverage notes that he became known in prison as a relatively compliant inmate and even recorded audiobooks for the blind for many years. But none of that has changed the central fact of his status. He remains imprisoned for life for murder. He has faced parole consideration multiple times. And in July 2024, according to recent reporting and California parole materials, Kemper was denied parole again. A People review of the case says that was his 12th denial and that his next hearing is scheduled for 2031. That same report notes a 2024 psychiatric evaluation found him at high risk for reoffending. That matters for 2 reasons. First, it reminds viewers that this is not just a relic of the 1970s. The legal system is still dealing with Edmund Kemper in the present tense. Second, it complicates the common fantasy that age automatically neutralizes a killer's danger. By 2024, Kemper was in his mid-70s and reportedly in declining health, yet evaluators still viewed him as a significant risk. So where is he now? Still incarcerated, still infamous, still studied, and still a reminder that some offenders remain culturally present long after their crimes are over. Not because they deserve immortality, but because their cases expose painful truths about violence, manipulation, and institutional failure. Part 9, was he born to kill? This is the question many documentaries circle, and it deserves a careful answer. Was Edmund Kemper born to kill? The honest answer is, we do not know. And anyone who claims to know with certainty is simplifying a case that is too complex for easy slogans. What we do know is that Kemper showed violent and abnormal behavior early, committed murder at 15, manipulated evaluators well enough to be released, and later murdered 6 young women, his mother, and her friend. We also know he was highly intelligent, deeply resentful, and capable of sustained predatory behavior over time. But born to kill can become dangerous language if it implies inevitability. It can make people feel as though nothing could have been done. That is not true. A teenager who has already committed double murder is not someone who should be casually trusted because he sounds cooperative in an institution. A man with that history should have been treated as profoundly dangerous. The system did not just fail to predict some invisible future, it failed after warning signs had already become blood reality. So maybe the better question is not whether he was born to kill. Maybe the better question is this: how many points were there when someone should have understood what he was? And how did he keep slipping through anyway? That is the real terror of the Kemper case. Not destiny, not horror movie fate, but the possibility that a person can be visibly dangerous, institutionally known, psychologically studied, and still go on to destroy more lives. Edmund Kemper's story is terrifying because it contains almost every element people fear most in a true crime case. Early warning signs, a failed system, predation hidden inside ordinary life, victims targeted through trust and vulnerability, a mother-son relationship warped into lifelong rage, and a killer who could explain himself just well enough to disturb people even more. He murdered his grandparents at 15. He was committed, studied, and released. He killed 6 young women around Santa Cruz between 1972 and 1973, which earned him the name the Co-Ed Killer. Then he murdered his mother and her friend. Then he drove to Colorado and confessed. He was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder in 1973, sentenced to life, and remains incarcerated in California after another parole denial in 2024. But behind the headlines and the infamous nickname are the lives he destroyed. Young women who should have reached home safely. A mother and friend whose lives ended in terror. A family history already stained by the murders of his grandparents. This is why the case still matters. Not because Edmund Kemper is interesting, but because the institutions around him failed. The victims deserve to be remembered, and the warning signs in this case were not subtle in hindsight, they were glaring. So no, the real lesson here is not that he was born to kill. The real lesson is more disturbing. Sometimes a killer is already telling the world what he is, and the world still lets him walk.